Okay, everyone, I'm back. Good morning again. My name is John Hagan. I'm chair of the Maine Climate Table. And what you see behind me by the magic of Zoom is Hannaford Hall at USM, which is where we were supposed to be today for a day-long statewide climate summit featuring climate leadership in Maine's business community. You all know what happened to that plan. Everybody's plans for convening in person have changed for the foreseeable future. But we decided not to let the pandemic stop us from keeping the conversation going about climate change in Maine. So we took the day-long event and broke it into four 2-hour online sessions over the next 3 weeks. Next Thursday, the Wednesday after that, and the following Thursday, the 15th, October 15th will be our last one. If you're here, you've registered for the event and you've seen the slate of speakers that we have over the coming weeks. If you don't know what the Maine Climate Table is, let me say a few words about that. Number one, we're not the Maine Climate Council. That's an entirely different entity launched by the governor. The Climate Table was formed in 2013 as a network of businesses and individuals and nonprofits to help keep the climate conversation going during the previous administration. The Climate Table really has two functions. It's pretty simple. Do what we can to keep everyone well informed about climate science and climate issues so they can make their own informed decisions. And secondly, to engage sectors that haven't been engaged on climate change or that may have been left out of the conversation about climate change because, and it sounds cliched at this point, but climate change really is going to take everyone, regardless of politics or cultural identity or economic status. If you're a Democrat, Democrats are never going to solve climate change alone. It really is going to take everybody. We need everybody, not a divided citizenry. So with that philosophy, if you will, that's what motivated our fall summit. We wanted to give the stage to the business community, which was really on the front lines of climate change, and not think about my fisherman friends in particular. I've spent most of my career in the nonprofit sector, all of it, okay, in the nonprofit sector, but I often worked with the for-profit sector. And one of the things that always impressed me about the business sector was how fast it could move when it wanted to. And so we've got a series of events over the next 4 weeks that really put the business community on the stage. We're not going to be able to solve the climate problem without the business community's leadership and participation. And so we wanted to spend some time with the business community and just learn from them. What worked, what hasn't worked, what do they need to be different to make it easier for them. So that's what this fall series is about. We're intentionally trying to engage some people who haven't maybe been engaged or been in the forefront of the climate issue. Maybe just a point about the COVID situation, because last June we were thinking about canceling this event entirely. We knew we had to go to virtual, but so many businesses were struggling at the time. People were getting laid off, and it was just a horrible situation, and really still is. But to the credit of our panelists that we got over the next several weeks, they all wanted to forge ahead, and I just give them tremendous credit for that. I know Bill Mook, who's up next week, Mook Sea Farm, said, John, I'll be there, but I don't know from day to day what's going to happen with my business. And I think that's still the case for a lot of people. So I just want to thank them for being willing to go forward with this event. Let's see, I'm going to introduce Adam Lee in a minute, our keynote speaker, but just a couple of things about the technical things about Zoom. I think probably everybody's familiar with Zoom by now, but at the bottom of your screen there is a Q&A button, and that's the mechanism by which attendees can send questions or comments up to me and to the panelists. And let's see, what else about that? Over the next hour, here's 2 hours, this is how it's going to go. Adam's going to give us some pearls of wisdom from his perspective. Then we've got an interview with economist Charles Colgan, and you can send in questions for Charles. It's a chance to talk to the economist yourselves. And then we've got the last hour will be, Adam's going to lead a panel on the future of affordable electric vehicles in Maine, or just in general. And Jennifer Brennan explained, one of the panelists explained to me last, says there's no future, it's already here. She's driving an affordable electric vehicle and has been for 5 years. So I think I'm going to go out and buy an electric vehicle after the webinar today. So that's all I've got. I think that's, if you've got a question, you can put it in the Q&A. Katie Perry, co-pilot with me today, will be monitoring those. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Adam. Adam, thank you for turning on your video. I know, Adam, we all feel like we know you, even though you don't know us, because we see you on television and we hear you on the radio a lot. So be patient if we treat you like a friend, because we think we know you. But Adam is, as most of you know, chairman of the board at Lee Auto Malls. He currently serves on the Muskie Board of Visitors, the MPBN board, the Maine Conservation Voters Board. He's served as chairman of Efficiency Maine Trust, and been chair of the Maine Audubon Corporate Partners. As near as I can tell, there's pretty much nothing Adam hasn't done. And in his spare time, he sold me a bunch of cars over the last 25 years. So Adam, if you can turn on, looks like your audio is on, you're all live, your video, and I'm gonna fade into the background and let you have the floor for 15 minutes. So
thank you, John. As John said, I'm Adam Lee, chairman of Lee Auto Malls. We are a family-owned, Maine-based company founded by my cousin's grandfather in 1936. And before I say any more, I have to acknowledge the irony of having a car dealer, the largest Dodge Ram truck dealer in the state, open a conference on climate change. And by the way, they actually make a model that gets 32 miles per gallon on the highway. So it's progress. We're also the largest all-electric Leaf dealer and Prius dealer in the state. The Climate Table's month-long summit is going to give you all sorts of information about what businesses, large and small, are and can be doing to lead on climate. It's going to take all of us working together to solve this problem. We have some really aggressive goals, but we can make a lot of progress towards hitting them if we stay focused, remain optimistic, and as businesses, do everything we can to keep moving forward. Now, a little about me. As John said, I'm not actually a car dealer, I just play one on TV. In the past, I have served 2 or 3 terms on the boards of the Natural Resources Council of Maine, as well as Maine Audubon and MOFGA. I was the first chairman of the Efficiency Maine Trust and the chair of the Reggie Trust, with my greatest accomplishment probably being to help hire Michael Stoddard, the executive director, who has done a phenomenal job, and he is still there. I am currently president of the board of Maine Conservation Voters. I've been committed to energy efficiency and preserving Maine's environment for most of my adult life. If there was one message that I want to convey today, it's this. If a car dealer can dedicate himself or herself to preserving our environment, then all of you can as well. So I have to tell you, I'm on my porch and I have 2 dogs chasing a chipmunk around my feet right now as we speak. So I'm going to do my best to remain still while the chipmunk runs around my feet. I want to applaud and thank the Maine Climate Table for recognizing that Maine businesses care about the environment, and many are already actively engaged in trying to do what they can to address climate change. In addition, many Maine businesses like ours have discovered that so many of the things we do that are good for the climate are also good for the bottom line. Our company is run by myself and my 2 partners. Don Lee, my cousin, is president, and John Isaacson, my friend, is our CEO. We've worked together for 33 years. longer. We've all tried to do what we can to make the actual business a little greener. We've done the easy steps. We've replaced interior and exterior lights with LEDs. And Efficiency Maine has a great program to help us do this. Some of our dealerships, I think, actually replaced outdoor bulbs, 500-watt bulbs with 100-watt bulbs, LEDs. The payback on this is, in some cases, 2.5 years. And the light is fine. And we can control them with an iPhone. It's just, the advantages are tremendous. We recycle everything we can. And car dealerships, believe it or not, generate an amazing amount of waste, mostly cardboard, because everything comes in cardboard, parts, body parts, door panels, everything's in cardboard. So we try very hard to recycle cardboard and the paper we generate. We've converted almost every dealership to natural gas or propane. There may be 1 or 2 small used car dealerships that we weren't able to. We have a small array of solar panels at our Toyota dealership, which helps offset the charging of electric cars. Some of the dealerships have these really expensive, super fast overhead doors in the shops. So they go up and down really fast to keep the heat in the winter. In the old days when it snowed, we'd send our salespeople out, between all our dealerships, there's got to be over 1,000 cars on our lots. And they would start every car and let them run until we, clean them off and move them. Today, we're not supposed to be doing that. We're supposed to just start them one at a time as we need to move it. There are really 2 things I am most proud of that have had some impact on the environment. The first is the fact that Lee Toyota is the largest Prius dealer in the state. The Prius came out in 2000, and people really didn't understand it. It runs on gasoline, it's got a battery. It didn't make any sense. It uses the brakes to regenerate electricity and recharge the battery. You don't plug it in, it gets 50 miles to the gallon. It was odd, and it stood out. And to top it all off, it was ugly. It really was not a very attractive car. Now, at that time, the car held, I believe it was 13 gallons of gas, and you could go 650 miles on a single tank, which is really remarkable. Now, despite how unattractive the car was, it captured my imagination. A car that cost $20,000, which was kind of steep, and got 50 miles to the gallon, and it was the only one in the market. So this is, 20 years ago. Now, in case nobody remembers back, in 1981, the Toyota Starlet cost $4,800 and got 54 miles per gallon. So it's a little discouraging to think about that. But so in the year 2001, most Toyota dealers had Priuses on their lot. They really didn't want to stock them. They weren't selling. People thought they were odd. We didn't know how to sell them. Well, at some point, these cars started backing up at the port. Ships come in from Japan and they try and unload the cars and then sell them to dealers. Being the unrealistic optimist that I was, I agreed to take extra trucks when they asked. At one point, I probably had close to 30 Priuses sitting on the lot. Now, keep in mind, we'd sell 1 or 2 a month, maybe 3, maybe an occasional one, extra. Well, with time, people started to get what the car was all about, and they did start to sell slowly. We always had 5 times more than anyone else. One of the things we did is, for some reason, a lot of the church fairs, churches were having like clean energy, clean car fairs, and they would call us, and we would show up anywhere. Anyone that asked, we would show up with a car and a salesperson to try and promote it. And I think that really made a difference. And the same with environmental groups when they had clean car, clean energy fairs. Now in 2001, gasoline was $1.30. It started to rise, and by 2008, it was $4 a gallon. That price, combined with the fact that Leonardo DiCaprio arrived at the Oscars in a Prius, really made the car take off. It's one of those things just nobody could have planned it. Now, at the time, we were the 3rd smallest Toyota dealer in the state. In other words, out of 12 dealers, everyone outsold us but the dealer in Rockport and the dealer in Holton. Now, however, since that time, we have been the #1 Prius dealer in the state, month in and month out. I guess sometimes things just work out when you take a chance and do something you believe in. I would say we are no longer the 3rd smallest Toyota dealer in the state. Now, the second thing I'm most proud of is this, and I don't know if you can put this on the screen, but I'll read it to you. It says, it's a headline from the Detroit News Washington Bureau: car dealer blasts automakers at EPA hearing. I like the headline. It's not really accurate, but I do like the headline. I was asked by the Clean Air Coordinator, NRCM, if I'd be willing to testify at a hearing in Maine on stronger fuel economy standards. Maine was trying to join California, which had a different standard than the federal government. And I think a lot of you probably know how this works, but back then the country had two standards: federal, which covered everybody, and California got to have their own. And if states wanted, they could try and join California so the state would have stricter standards. So I was asked to testify in Augusta, and I'd never done this before. And I agreed and testified there. And before I knew it, I found myself being contacted by this group in California, Cater Communications, which had been hired to help states raise their fuel economy standards and preserve the federal standards. California standards. And I was asked if I would testify elsewhere. I agreed, and I soon found myself in Arlington, Virginia, on a panel in front of around 200 people testifying before the EPA. It was sort of surreal. I'd never done anything like this. I had in Augusta in a very small room in front of a handful of people. So I'm in this huge room in front of the federal EPA. There's a screen that was literally 10 by 20 feet at the front of the room, and whoever was testifying was being projected onto this screen. Your head was like the size of one of those Easter Island heads. I had lobbyists from the auto industry on either side of me testifying. Now, for some reason, the EPA didn't realize that I was testifying in favor of giving California their waiver, which is what they needed to continue with their standard. So they put me up there with the auto lobbyists who were about to explain why the US economy and the world as we know it would come to an end if we forced them to raise fuel economy. And this is essentially what they say when they're asked to put seatbelts in a car, anti-lock brakes, unleaded gasoline, that, car industry in the world will come to an end. The best part of the hearing was when I introduced myself and said that I was testifying in support of the California waiver. Both lobbyists, so on either side of me, literally picked up their chairs and moved like 3 feet away. I think they thought that my liberal environmental views would actually be contagious. It was in the air. In the end, due to the efforts of thousands of environmentalists, California got their waiver, and Maine and 12 other states and DC mirror them. The new fuel economy standards have been frozen in place by the Trump administration, and they're desperately trying to roll them back. And when they first started this, I'd point out that even the auto industry said they were not in favor, which is an unusual thing. This leads me to a couple of not so popular facts, but I think it's important to point out. For the past, I don't know, maybe 5 years, and this number has been getting bigger, each year in this country, we sell around 17 million new cars. So this is through the whole country. About 2% of those are electric, so about 340,000 units. These cars save us around 160 million gallons of gasoline a year, which is great. So we sell 340,000 electric cars a year. Those 340,000 cars save us about 160 million gallons of gas, which is about how much gasoline this country uses in half a day. Now, here's where we can't lose sight of another statistic. If we raise the average fuel economy of new cars sold just this year by 2.5 miles per gallon, which is about 10%, believe it or not, it seems so low, it would save us 776 million gallons of gas a year. That's about 5 times the savings from the electric cars. So I'm not suggesting for a minute that we stop promoting or trying to sell and preparing for a future of electric cars, but we can't let the federal government roll back fuel economy. We need to continue to work hard at that as well, because the savings are tremendous. So in the end, we have to do both. And with that, thank you for your attention. I hope the numbers weren't too boring. I'm sure those of you who tuned in today and to future sessions of the Climate Table's month-long Climate Summit will learn plenty. We'll have a chance through Q&A to offer you some of your own ideas about what businesses are and can be doing now. Thank you for joining us. And right now I will turn it back to John and hopefully get that chipmunk off the porch.
Okay, thank you, Adam. That was great. And thank you for fighting for fuel standards way back in 2007. Um, so Adam will be back in, in 30, 40 minutes or so, but we're going to pivot now to an interview. I'm going to ask Charles Colgan a few questions, and Charles should be on your screen now. Welcome, Charles. Good to see you.
Morning.
Let me just say a few words of intro to Charles. He's a professor emeritus of public policy and planning at University of Southern Maine. And I did not know this until recently, but director of research at the Center for the Blue Economy at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies in Monterey, California. Middlebury apparently has a marine facility on the West Coast. Charles also serves as editor of the Journal of Ocean and Coastal Economics. Prior to joining University of Maine, probably a lot of you know this, he served as in the Maine State Planning Office as the state economist and as Director of Natural Resources and Economic Policy. So Charles, welcome this morning. I've got a series of questions I'd like to ask you. Who knows where this might go? But thank you for being here. I feel like you're the second most known person. Adam is number one and you're number two, because I've been listening to you on the radio and your economic analysis for as long as I can remember. So really grateful for you being here today. I thought, back to the audience for a minute. If you've got questions for Charles, this is a great time to ask. Just use your Q&A button at the bottom and type in your question as we go. And we're going to reserve 10, 15 minutes at the end to ask an economist your best question. So use that. But I'll get started here. And Charles, I'd like to start at a kind of high level, and then we'll come down to the scale of Maine and what climate change might mean for Maine's economy. But I wonder if you could help us understand climate change from an economist perspective. It seems like to me that humans aren't very good at thinking long term, especially about cost and benefits over the decade scale. You know, for most of our human evolution, probably 95% of it, our challenge was just to live till morning. And we didn't think too much about next year or a decade down the line. So I'm wondering if you could, I know you economists think longer term, especially now that we've got climate change. I wonder if you could help us understand how we should be thinking about the long-term impacts and opportunities too of this very unusual problem over such a long time frame. How do you economists think about this?
Well, the first thing I note, John, is that you're sitting there with a backdrop of Hannaford Hall, where I've given dozens and dozens of speeches over the years. So I feel like I wish you'd shared that with me so I could feel like I was back home doing presentations. I am home in Maine, but we make long-term decisions all the time. We take out 30-year mortgages on our houses. We invest in commercial office structure and hospitals and roads and bridges that will last, have expected useful lives of 50 to 100 years. So one of the things that you have to understand is that we are already adapting to climate change. We are already acting to mitigate our effects on climate change with the investment decisions that we are currently making. The problem is that the problem isn't that we don't think long term. The problem is not necessarily we don't necessarily recognize that climate change is an issue. We're just not very good at it. We do not really fully understand, for a whole bunch of reasons, all of the implications of climate change, nor do we take them into account in the long-term decisions that we're making. As Adam points out, there are a lot of short-term decisions that we can make. We can switch out LEDs. We can put some solar panels on, but at the fundamental structural change level, where we're going to have to act, if we're going to be effective in reducing the already baked in effects of climate change. And climate change is not something that is happening in the future. It is already happening. We are already half or more of the way to a extent of climate change where essentially things become unmanageable. So it's here. It's been here for 30 years. Some of the first reported really serious looks at climate change came from the oil industry back in the 70s. So it's not like this, we haven't known about this, but we've not been very good at it for a whole bunch of reasons. And I think that what economists are trying to do these days is to show people the alternatives that they face and what are the costs and benefits of, say, taking no action versus a whole series of possible actions. And I'll come back to this again and again to point out that the costs of climate change are already being incurred. We are already paying them. They're paying them in big time in California. They're paying them big time in southwestern Louisiana and eastern Texas, where hurricanes with much greater moisture than normal have come through and created flooding. We're already paying those costs. The question is, how do we bear these costs into the future? And the basic point is that it is guaranteed that reducing climate change effects in the future will be much, much orders of magnitude cheaper than trying to adapt to the climate change that otherwise will occur. We have a very distorted view of the costs of climate change that I think economists are trying to get people to deal with. Now, there's a lot of risk and uncertainty in all of this. We don't know. We know that most of my work, or much of my work these days, is on sea level rise and how to adapt to it. We know the direction and possible extent of sea level rise, but we do not know the exact pace or the amount by which sea levels can rise. So how do we make decisions under that? Well, economists have a bunch of tools for dealing with that, trying to take risk into account. The work we're doing right now, for example, takes the same models, the same economic models that the oil industry uses to decide where to drill, and applies those to the problem of which kinds of adaptive decisions should be made. We've got a project right here in Maine where we're trying to help the water district in Saco and the Maine Water Company make decisions about their infrastructure using the same tools that the oil industry used to decide where to drill. So we've got a lot of work to do to convince people that mitigation is cheaper than adaptation. Adaptation is still necessary because we've waited too long. And now the problem is we have to deal with some very unfamiliar risks, but there are ways to deal with them if we make some specific decisions that climate change is something that we have to build into our decision making.
Thank you. Sticking to the high level for just another minute or so, we all probably saw, I think it was on Tuesday this week, that China announced that it would be carbon neutral by 2060, which sounded like good news to me. What do you think, how important is that in terms of the economy? Do we need to set goals like that? What does it mean for the US, say, if we don't keep up and set goals like that? Not that that's ambitious enough, but at least it's been stated now. Do we need a goal like that too, from just purely economic perspective?
China is the #1 emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and so a commitment from them is important. And they have some difficult problems, some difficult challenges. I was in Beijing giving a set of presentations on other work that I do a couple of years ago, and it was right at the end of October. And Beijing, downtown Beijing is entirely district heated based on coal plants. So the coal-fired power plants that surround Beijing and give the city its air quality problems, among other things, provides not only the electricity for Beijing, but it also provides steam heat for almost all the downtown area. And they don't turn that heat on until November 1st. And I was there on October 30th and 31st. And so they had no heat in the buildings because it wasn't November 1st yet. So taking those coal plants offline and replacing them with renewables is a real problem because you can replace the electricity, but not the heat. And that's one of the reasons I think you're looking at 2060, but 2060 is a long, long way away. A lot of American states, California and probably Maine, are looking at carbon neutrality by 2040. I don't have an inventory of where all the states are in terms of carbon neutrality pledges, but those that are actually doing climate policy have set much more aggressive goals. The obvious outlier here is the federal government, which is unlikely to set a climate neutrality goal without a significant change in policy and policymakers. But the good news is that a lot of American states, including some like California, which is 12% of the economy and maybe 13, 14% of emissions, have set much more aggressive goals.
Okay, so maybe bringing it down a little closer to home. I think when we chatted 3 or 4 weeks ago, you were explaining how we humans transformed our behavior in a matter of a couple of weeks. You said it would have taken a decade without a pandemic. I wonder if you could say, do you have any thoughts? Because I know economists have gotten more interested in human behavior, in the last decade or so. Can you say anything from an economist's perspective? What are your thoughts about how fast we can change when we need to?
Well, let me just say that economists have always been interested in human behavior. It's just that we have become more interested in several different approaches to human behavior than the ones that we had traditionally used. Just want to make
okay, thank you.
this whole idea of behavioral economics, like economists going back to Adam Smith didn't care about human behavior, is sort of misleading. So I think the pandemic, there are 3 lessons I take quickly from the pandemic, and obviously there are a lot more lessons that are going to play out in the future. The first is, if you don't like COVID-19, wait until we have one of these every 3 to 5 years as the temperature warms past 2 degrees Celsius. That's what a lot of the climate models are suggesting, is that one of the biggest threats of climate change is in health, and in particular is in the liberation of a number of deadly vector-borne diseases that mankind has suffered from in the past, but controlled, and new vector-borne diseases like COVID-19. An increase in the number of pandemics and essentially repeating what we're experiencing right now on a regular basis is one of the reasons why we really need to do something about climate change. Second thing I'd point out is our current debates about COVID-19 and masks are a good example of why it's so hard for us to deal with climate change. The benefit of wearing a mask is largely to keep the spread of the disease down. people can have the infection but be non-symptomatic and can spread the disease. The mask reduces that substantially. So the reason to wear masks is mostly for the benefit of everyone else, not necessarily for our own personal benefit. But many people don't see that. They don't see the collective benefit. They only see the individual inconvenience. And there is a direct analogy to climate change where there's a direct analogy to climate change where the collective benefit is hard to see, and the individual cost or the individual inconvenience is easy to see. So we have a situation in which mask deniers and climate deniers happen to largely be the same people. And the COVID-19 example shows exactly the problem of denying the collective problem that we have, focusing only on the individual inconveniences that we suffer. And the result is right before us to see. The third thing I would say about COVID-19 and the pandemic is more optimistic. Economists like myself who are concerned with the spatial relationships of economic activity have been saying for nearly 30 years, how much has technology, information and communications technology, meant the death of distance? It doesn't matter where you are. And there's been this huge debate in the economics field about whether we will continue to need to gather in physical space as we have done since the Babylonian times in order to interact with one another, or whether technology will liberate us to have the same kinds of interactions, but at a distance. Well, we're all sitting here at a distance, folks. We're not sitting in Hannaford Hall. We're sitting at home or in our offices or wherever we are. And that has happened because in a very short period of time, the technologies were all in place to keep much of the economy moving without physical presence. And this has huge implications for what I call the spatial economy. It has huge implications for how we will live, how we will work. REI, the Regional Recreational Equipment Incorporated, the Al Bean of the Northwest, had invested in a $50 million new office park, and they were going to open it in April. They've decided to sell the thing, and everybody's going to work from home in the future. Google will not bring its employees back to the office until the summer of 2021. Something is going on here that is profound in terms of our use of space and technology that has enormous implications for our energy use and our interactions with the climate. It happened much faster than anybody thought it could happen. All the technology is already in place. It needs to be improved. I'm sure most of those of us on this event are now living on Zoom, and all of us can think of ways to improve the technology. But we did a lot very quickly, and that has some really important implications for all of the projections about how we will use energy in the future. I've not been able to figure all of that out yet because we've only been doing this for 6 months. But it really is an important issue. And because we have this really urgent need to reconfigure buildings, transportation, and our use of space in order to get climate change under control, we have now been given an opportunity. We have now seized an opportunity to be much more aggressive about that than we thought we would have.
Thank you. You said also in our earlier conversation, and don't let me misquote you. I may be paraphrasing. You said something like, it's kind of now or never. We've got an opportunity, maybe not an opportunity. We need to go ahead and move now, and maybe COVID has helped us appreciate. Could you say a little more about why you feel like this is the moment?
Well, it's not so much an economic question. It's just what's coming out of the climate models. Basically, the climate models have always had in them a period in which, once you get past certain thresholds in the climate, bad things start to happen much more rapidly. And the best example of this is the melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice shelves, which it were it to happen rapidly within, in some models, days, could raise sea levels by as much as 10 feet. Those tipping points have always been somewhat off in the distance into the 2040 or so, but we now know that many of those tipping points are likely to happen much faster. The most recent research suggests there is already substantial faulting in the West Antarctic ice shelf, far faster than the climate models had projected. And so we've both let time pass to get closer to the tipping points we used to think were far in the distance, and the tipping points have in fact come closer to us because of the extent of climate change that has happened. So the need to move aggressively and get towards carbon neutrality on a much more aggressive schedule is that much higher, and the next decade is the critical one. Either we have committed enough resources and made enough progress to keep the temperature from rising much above 2 degrees Celsius. We've already passed 1 degree from pre-industrial times, so we're already halfway to the catastrophe level. But the acceleration of the pace of change is now significant, and so we really do need to act sooner rather than later. And that most of the climate models are saying you really got to make major decisions this decade, or there will be an unrecoverable catastrophic result.
I made the comment in my opening to the session today. I had worked with some businesses, a lot of businesses in my career, and I made the comment that they always seem to be able to move really fast when they decided to move. Do you have any thoughts about how you would advise businesses to think about climate change?
Yeah, I think there's several things. As I said at the beginning, we all may take into account the long term when we're making a lot of our business decisions, a lot of our public investment decisions. And so we're used to dealing with these kinds of problems, and we're used to thinking about the risks that we might face when we make those decisions. Businesses think about, well, if I expand my operations, if I invest in new facilities, can I survive a recession? So recessions are systemic risks. They're risks to our business that sit in the system. They're outside of our control. Well, climate change is now a systemic risk. And if this year does not teach you anything about the meaning of systemic risk, things that are outside of your control but can hugely affect your businesses, then you haven't been paying attention. The pandemic is, in a sense, the pandemic is like climate change 20 plus years ago. We have always known the literature on what would happen when a virus mutated in a wet market somewhere in China and escaped from a mammal into the human population and rapidly worked its way through the human population. That possibility has been known since the 80s. Public health officials and epidemiologists have planned for that happening since the 80s. We just didn't execute the plans. So systemic risk is part of this. A lot of this is going to be what are our individual businesses and that are contributing to this. There's a coming wave of technologies to help us better understand our interaction with the climate. So that's something to look for. The second thing is there's a lot of money to be made in the climate, in this change. We have to reinvent the economy in 20 years. This is like going back to 1900, and I'll stick with something from, in terms of Adam's comfort zone. 1900, there were very few cars on the road. Most people moved by horses still. There was a little bit of electrification of urban transportation. By 1920, most cities had electric railways. Most cities had cars. The car would, in the 1920s, become a popular item of consumption with Henry Ford. And there was a huge amount of money to be made, and people who figured out that that transition was happening made the money. And people who resisted the transition got left in fairly niche businesses with no opportunities for growth. The markets have already moved on this. The markets have already made their decision about what's where the future lies. The electric vehicle discussion is an example of this. And just to reinforce that point, Tesla now has a higher market capitalization than ExxonMobil. And ExxonMobil has been removed from the Dow Jones Industrial Average, where it has been since 1928. So everybody has been so focused on the costs of our business of dealing with climate change, they've ignored the opportunities that are there. It's like we are ferociously protecting the buggy whip industry and keeping Henry Ford in his garage tinkering on the early version of the Model T. Two other things. One is, coming up on the outside is a wave of litigation about climate change. Hasn't hit yet, but there are already large numbers of lawyers and groups thinking of adopting a strategy to deal with climate change, since the government won't do it, to try and do it through the courts. And if you don't like bureaucrats making decisions about these kinds of things, let me assure you, you're going to like tort lawyers doing it even less. So that's another part of the risk that we face, is not just the physical changes, but the changes in the economic system, which may become very focused on litigation rather than dealing with more regular policy making. And I guess the other thing I would say is, mitigation is cheaper than adaptation. Repeat. This is something that the business community has to be a major voice on. You can't leave it to academic economists like me. It's going to be cheaper to fix the problem. It's going to be cheaper to avoid the problem than to keep fixing it. There is not enough money to adapt the country and our infrastructure and our society to the level of threat that we face from climate change. There just isn't enough money.
I'm going to pivot now to a couple questions from the attendees. But first, put in a plug for next week. Megan Hellstedt from Hannaford is going to be with us next week. And Megan was just telling us yesterday that they're very systematically and carefully taking the lessons from that they've learned from COVID and crosswalking them very intentionally to what does that tell us about climate change. So I think that's one really good example of how our businesses are learning from what they're experiencing right now. So come back next week if you want to hear from Megan and others. Let me just turn to a couple questions that have come in from the Q&A while we've got a few minutes left in this session. And Charles, I'm just going to read because to get it right. First one is, does the state of Maine have the financial capacity to take on bonded indebtedness at a level sufficient to transform the electric grid for beneficial electrification, as in the example of deploying electric cars, trucks, boats, and charging stations? I guess it's about can we afford, and I think I know what you're going to say, but can we afford this, to take on this debt?
Well, who says the state of Maine has to pay for it? Who says we have to pay for it as taxpayers? We don't pay for gasoline pumps as taxpayers. We pay for it as consumers. If you take into account if we orient the market so that people pay for what they're using, as we do with most everything else, yes, there's enough money to do it because we're already doing it. We might need some initial catalyzing funds to get something started, and there are probably some issues out in rural Maine that the state may have to assist with, but for the vast majority of it, the private sector is going to do this, and we're going to pay for it as private sector consumers.
Next question. How much longer do you suspect the insurance industry can spread the cost of climate related disasters to everyone before the cost of insurance becomes crippling to the economy, nationally or globally?
The answer is not long. The natural disasters are now the biggest challenge facing the property and casualty and the reinsurance of the property and casualty insurers. Already, the property and casualty companies have made noises about refusing to insure property in the wildland-urban interface in California. After Hurricane Andrew in 1992, the property and casualty private property and casualty insurance industry left the state of Florida. The state of Florida is now the principal insurer of private property in California against hurricanes. A major disaster like Hurricane Andrew, again, would bankrupt the state of Florida overnight. So yeah, the insurance industry, they can absorb a lot of it. The reinsurance industry has become extremely creative at finding ways to raise capital to do reinsurance, but there's a limit, and we've already found the limit in some places on the coast and some places confronting fire dangers.
If anyone wants to ask a question while we've got a few minutes left, I'm going to pose another one in the meantime. Charles, I know you at least reviewed the recent report about the cost of doing nothing, which I would encourage everyone that's interested in the details to take a look at. It's on the Maine Climate Council's website. But the cost, looking at Maine specifically, where do you think our greatest vulnerabilities are in terms of the economics, our economic viability?
I think that the cost of doing nothing report is actually, I actually helped the Climate Council design that study, and then I served as an external reviewer of it when it was being done. I think it generally identifies and puts numbers to a lot of the major risks, and does a good job within the current body of knowledge for what those risks are. I think that my one concern about it in terms of conveying the scope of the problem is, and I think this is largely driven by the way the Climate Council itself has gone, which is to focus on the natural resource industries, forests, fisheries, agriculture. We still have in Maine this picture of ourselves as we're lumber, fish, and potatoes. We're not. Those things are important, but overall we're healthcare, services, and retail. That's who we are. I think that the risks in urban areas were not as investigated as thoroughly, and this was mostly a time and cost resource issue. But just take one quick example, which is the Fore River. On the Portland side, there has been an enormous investment in new hotels, new office buildings, new structures of all kinds, all of it in the area subject to sea level rise flooding. On the South Portland side of the Fore River, Almost every drop of oil that Maine uses comes through South Portland and tanks that are sitting within the flood zone. Not the historic flood zone, the 100-year flood. Everybody's still using the 100-year flood, but the whole point about climate change is a 100-year flood is virtually meaningless. It's not 100 years ago anymore. So we're still making major investments in our urban areas that are at risk, and I wish more had been pointed out about that.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to, let's see, maybe we got 2 more open questions. Let me see if I can catch one more. Oh, this is a really good one, and I wanted to ask, could a national carbon tax help the economy transition more efficiently, or maybe the kinder term is a fee and dividend model? What are your thoughts about that?
Like most economists, I'm limited by my education, and think that a carbon tax is the cleanest, simplest way to give people the incentives to get off of carbon and onto something else. We hate the term tax. People have talked about a tax or a fee and dividend. We hate the idea of paying taxes. They are essentially off the table politically for the foreseeable future. So we're going to have to design some other things which are going to be less efficient. We're going to pay more as a society to achieve our ends than we have to. And we have very limited resources to do this with because the demands are so high. So we're going to waste money doing it, but it's the only politically acceptable way to get enough motion and time is essentially to waste a lot of money.
Well, and the dividend idea is that the money, the revenue taken in goes back to people somewhat equally, I think. Is that how the concept is supposed to work?
Well, I mean, there's a carbon tax which you could use as a tax, like the fuel tax. What a radical idea. So you could fix roads with it, and you could make adaptation investments in infrastructure with it. You could take the fuel tax in Maine and raise it to California levels. We pay about $1 a gallon in California, and we spend the money on the roads. That would be an enormous improvement and assistance in public adaptation. But we don't do that with taxes, and so we're going to do it as much less efficiently. The other idea is, because people hate taxes, make you pay them at the pump or at the market and then rebate it to you at the end of the year. It's not a bad idea, except for the minor problem that nowhere where this has been proposed have people accepted it as an alternative. So it's trying to get around a political problem which people don't want to do.
Politics. And before we get into politics, we'll stop this session. So thank you, Charles, for this great conversation and answering all of our questions. There may be a few more that have come in, but we need to transition back to our EV panel. So Charles, thank you very much for being with us today. Stay with us if you want to hear some ideas about EVs, electric vehicles. Everybody on the webinar right now, there's no way that we know of to shut down and put the webinar on pause, but we're going to take 3 or 4 minutes here to get the next panel up and going. We got to promote them from attendees to panelists so they can see their videos. So, and Adam's going to lead that. So everybody just take 3 or 4 minutes and don't go far because we're not going to be long. And just be back at like 11:05. That's just a few minutes away. And let me check in. Adam, you can hear me okay? And let me do a sound check with you. And Katie, maybe you can turn your audio on so I can coordinate with you.
Yep, I have just promoted Jeff, Jennifer, and Barry.
Okay, Jeff, Jennifer, and Barry.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Jeff. How's everything in Montreal?
Well, things are pretty good.
Is that where you are, right?
I'm actually about an hour south, right on the right on the U.S. border.
Okay, and Jennifer, good morning.
Good morning.
It's early in California.
Well, this is usually when I start anyway,
Okay. Okay.
but yeah, I'm drinking my coffee or my tea with my Maine mug.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. As you'll find out in a minute, it was only recently that she was a Mainer, and she's back in California.
Well, they don't, they don't consider you a real Mainer.
Adam, she's not a real Mainer, right? No, you gotta.
She's actually from California, I believe.
Okay, so
I think we should be issuing temporary, credit, Maine credit or something after 10 years.
15 years in Maine.
Yeah, honorary. And word is the winters got to you a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
I've been watching the weather back there, and I have to say, I'm not missing it.
You have to say what?
I'm not missing it, the cold. I saw it was already 30 degrees the other night.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Jennifer, we're back to like 75.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you all. It's great. We've got a Zoom lock on all of you. And Adam, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let me just remind all of the attendees, ask questions while we've got our panelists here today, and you can ask Adam questions too. Use the Q&A, and we'll take some time at the end to answer your questions. So I'm going offline here, and Adam, again, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, John. I thought I'd start by doing just first a little intro, a little history on electric cars. In the late 1800s through the turn of the century, 1920s maybe, electric cars made up 40% of all cars on the road. And everybody has forgotten that there was a time when a decision had to be made. Do we go electric? Do we go with oil? With advances in the internal combustion engine and the availability of cheap gas, we ended up with gas, and that's how we get to where we are. So this is not the first time that the composition of our fleet may undergo a change. In case anybody missed it, there was an article in the New York Times just a few days ago that we're making dramatic inroads into reducing the cost of batteries much quicker than we'd expected, which could mean that an electric future is closer than we thought. There is a statistic I like to cite because I really do have faith that this country, and frankly the world, but certainly this country could do absolutely anything if they put their mind to it. In 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik, a satellite. All it did was a little thing about the size of a basketball, and it went around and it beeped. That's all it did. It caught us completely off guard. We were not able to do it at that time. We didn't know they were going to do it, although we were warned within a few days of the shot. That was 57. 12 years later, 69, we were walking on the moon. And we are the only country that has ever walked on the moon. Other countries have landed, but it's one thing to land. It's another thing to put a man on the moon, get him back in a spaceship, and get him back home. It took 12 years, from not being able to launch a simple satellite to landing on the moon. It's astounding. And what I'd say is we can do anything. We just don't have the will to do it. And that's the key. And I know the panelists, I don't know Jeff, I know the others well. I know that they are optimists and firmly believe we can do whatever we put our mind to. It's not possible to address climate change without addressing transportation. Over half of Maine's greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. We have a lot of challenges transitioning to electric cars. The first is they're expensive. However, they are coming down. The average price of a car in this country is $37,000. The average price of an electric car is between $35 and $40, depending on incentives. So that's helpful that they're coming down. The second is convincing people that a 250 to 300 mile range, which is about the most you get today, is adequate in convincing them that the infrastructure to charge the cars exists. We have a great panel today. I'm going to give each one just a word and let them talk a little bit more about what they do. Jennifer Brennan, who's joining us from California, is currently the transportation manager at the California Department of General Services. It's a very long title. Until last June, she worked for Efficiency Maine, managing the EV rebate program and EV charging infrastructure projects. Prior to that, she worked for the Office of
Greater Portland Council of Governments.
GP Cog, and before that for John Kerry. So she's been in Maine working on these issues for a very long time. Barry Woods, who is the most optimistic environmentalist I know, is Director of Electric Vehicle Innovation for Revision Energy, who is a phenomenal company. If you need a little plug, if you need anything solar or batteries, call Barry or Revision. I'll let him talk a little bit more about what he does. And Jeff Turner is a senior researcher and clean mobility lead at Dunsky Energy. It's a Canadian firm based in Montreal, specialized in design, evaluation, and analytical support of sustainable energy initiatives across North America. And while I haven't worked with Jeff, I've worked with Philippe Dunsky. They're a great firm. I recommend them. And with that, I thought I'd start with Jennifer. Just tell me a little more about what you're doing out there and why you do what you do.
Sure. So currently I am with the state of California, and I'm the transportation manager chief of the Executive Office of Sustainability. And so currently my only job, which is a big job, is to oversee a team of engineers that install EV charging infrastructure at state facilities. So in California, very large state, hundreds, thousands of facilities. That is my only job. Included in that, I reach out to our clients or other state agencies. So like Caltrans, the CDCR, the Department of Corrections, Fish and Wildlife, all these very large agencies. I talk them into installing EV charging at their facilities. Another thing I'm working on is, because of the state's budget deficit, I am focused on bringing in additional revenue for charging infrastructure. So I'm working on bringing in funds from the Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program, from Cali VIP incentives and rebates from utilities to bring in more money for our projects. And so I'm very focused on funding. But so basically the only task right now, where compared in the past in Maine, where I worked on a lot of different things with the actual EVs and the rebates and getting installations, I'm focused solely on getting the infrastructure in place so that state facilities and the state fleet can charge vehicles at these facilities. And in terms of why I do this, I realized when I did my bio, I've been working on environmental issues for 30 years. And it started in college, or Earth Week. I organized an Earth Week at school back in 1990. And from there, it just kind of grew. I was focused on environmental issues, mostly clean air issues. I didn't have a car for 8 years. And then it just kind of snowballed into additional things. I worked in Washington, D.C. at the Center for Clean Air Policy. And we had an annual meeting one night, and we had a guest speaker from NASA. And he set up his little, remember those old, the overhead sheets, the plastic, where they would write on them and it would project. He went through the scenario of climate change and what would happen if we didn't do anything about it. And everything that he talked about then is coming true now. And at the time, it was the first time I had really understood what was going to happen. And it actually made me sick to my stomach. And I realized that there wasn't an urgency to solve the problem. So from then forward, I've been working to remedy the problem. And so for the last 10 years, I've been focused solely on electric vehicles, because the largest source in Maine and in California as well is transportation. So I've been focused on getting people into cleaner cars to reduce the impacts on climate change. So that's what I'm doing. That's why I do it. And I'm optimistic. I'm really glad that Dr. Colgan outlined some of those things that are happening and will happen. And I'm seeing it in California now with the fires. For 30 days, I had to check the air quality index to see if it was safe, if I could walk outside to take a walk. So we're seeing it here on the front lines. And I'm also glad that Adam, as a business person, is outlining, that America can do anything if we put our mind to it. But unfortunately, I'm not seeing the will of individuals. And because transportation is something that we're all a part of and can help solve. I'm not seeing that people are making it a priority. So that's what I do every day, and that's why. I think you're on mute, Adam.
Barry, you want to talk a little bit about what you do at Revision and why you do what you do?
I'd be happy to, Adam, and thank you for the kind remarks. And Jennifer, we miss you.
Miss you too.
I think you'll be back at some point, though.
Next summer.
So my name is Barry Woods. I'm Director of Electric Vehicle Innovation with Revision Energy, which, as Adam mentioned, we're really involved in energy transition in our 3-state territory, Maine, Mass, and New Hampshire. My role is really fairly straightforward, which is sales and business development to try to bring in charging infrastructure related projects, primarily commercial, as into the growing portfolio of clean energy projects that Revision is involved in. And needless to say, it segues nicely with a lot of the other technologies that we work with, particularly solar. And it's obviously such a rapidly changing environment in terms of both policy and the technology costs and opportunities. So it's a very exciting area to be involved in. And I am optimistic. Just in terms of my my interest in electric vehicles, I'm not a car guy. I actually am a recovering attorney who made the mistake of taking a renewable energy law class when I was thinking of retrofitting my legal career probably about 12 years ago. And that led me into thinking about energy more generally. And I got involved with a group in Oregon that was a nonprofit for smart grid technologies. And I realized it was such a vast area that for me to make any kind of progress, focusing would be really important on a particular technology. And the car as a mobile battery source and the first really kind of ubiquitous smart appliance that's going to be available to the consumer sort of really resonated with me. And those are the kinds of bizarre thought processes that lead you down these roads. So, and anyway, I mean, so I'm no longer an attorney, although it's hard not to think like one occasionally. But I am involved in this space because I feel like the transportation sector is a huge lift and also a really critical lift to meeting the climate action goals that we as a society have. And I am optimistic that we can get there, as Adam pointed out. I mean, Sputnik was a 12-year venture. You know, I think it may take us a little bit longer with the transportation side, but I think it's really a question of when, not if, and hopefully that when can be accelerated the more people learn about the technology. So thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Barry. Jeff, I'm going to turn over to you. You can, I thought maybe just tell us a little bit about you and why you do what you do. And then I'm going to have you jump right in and talk about some of the things, some of the programs you've designed, whether Canada or I know you've done work in the US as well.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So yeah, as Adam mentioned, Dunsky is a firm. We're based in Montreal. And I actually, my own home, I live right on the US border. So I'm about an hour south of Montreal. And so I look often down to the US and I grew up going to the Maine coast every year. It was my favorite camping trip every year out in, I don't know if folks know Hermit Island Campground. And so that was a highlight of every year. And now when I look, you know, I'm an EV driver. And when I look at maps of charging stations and future EV road trips, that is my #1 destination. So I'm eager to navigate through the roads to get out to the Maine coast on an EV. A little bit of background. So I'll talk a bit more about the work that we do afterwards. But just to start, I guess I would say I am a car guy. I have this weird dual personality. I grew up with a subscription to motor trend, but I've always been an energy nerd as well and really concerned about the environment. And I went into studying mechanical engineering at McGill University with a focus on wanting to do something about the clean energy transition. And with my, you know, passion about cars, EVs was just the natural landing place for me. And so while I was at McGill, I actually got my toes wet on electric vehicles very quaintly in a Canadian way through an electric snowmobile project. So there was a student design competition to build electric snowmobiles, compete with them in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan at a student competition. And so the first few EVs that I ever drove were ones that I built myself, and they were snowmobiles. But through that, we started playing with different types of cars. And since then, my career has really been focused on EVs. I spent some time on Canada's West Coast in Vancouver, both working for an electric truck manufacturer. It was a partner of Ford's. And then after that, I worked for BC Hydro, the Maine utility in British Columbia, where I was focused on their EV infrastructure programs. So over my career now, since I joined Dunsky here in Montreal, it's been shifting from the engineering side a little bit more towards the policy side. And so at Dunsky, a lot of the work that we do, so Dunsky has a long history of working in energy efficiency and renewables. When I joined the team almost 4 years ago, that was part of a shift to really tackle mobility. And electric mobility was really kind of a natural starting place for us, given our existing work in the electricity sector. And so in that space, we do a lot of work to understand what is the potential for electric vehicle technology? What are the main barriers to adoption? And I'm sure we'll dive into some of those barriers. But through that work, we're helping, whether they're governments, anywhere from the municipal level all the way up to the federal level, and electric utilities as well, helping them figure out what are the steps they can take to address those barriers, and even forecasting the impact of those steps, so we can get a sense of what is the likely adoption of EVs over time, and how can they optimize their interventions in the market to maximize their impact. So that's been a lot of fun, a lot of work across Canada, also in the northeast of the US as well. And so I think there's, this is all happening in the context of rapid development on the technology side. So when I was working on those electric snowmobiles and, Chevy first announced the Volt back in 2010 or so, it was exciting to see that thing in the flesh for the first time. And it was a bit of a science project. Now to get to the point where, EVs are in the mainstream news pretty much every day, and they're something that you see out on the road all the time. So it's been really exciting to watch that transition. And I think it's fun to think about what are the next steps now as we go from, promising early steps to really look at mainstream adoption in the near-term future.
Okay, good. Thank you, Jeff. So I'm going to pose the question to all three of you, but then I'll call on you one by one. In Maine or in Montreal, Barry, I know you've been working in this area for a long time. How do you feel about the progress we're making? And if you're going to name 1, 2, or 3 things that we need to do to scale up, so we're not at 1 or 2% EV sales, but 3%, 4%, 5%, what would you say? So how's the progress, and what are the steps we need to take?
So Jennifer's living in the gold standard for electric vehicles in the United States, which is California, and I think followed by some of the other Western states like Washington and Oregon. I look at New England and I'd say I'd give Maine probably a C+, B-, and Mass is maybe, B+, A-. I was a school teacher at a time. I'm a tough grader, and New Hampshire's getting a D for sure. And Vermont may be getting an A. It's just that they don't have enough people to make as much of an impact with that good policy. So I'd say Maine is doing much better now than it was. The progress is accelerating, and I think it's going to continue to accelerate in the short term as a result of really good policy movement by the current administration. And it would move a lot faster if we had a federal policy and incentives that were more consistent and broader. So I give Maine overall much better marks now than a while back. I just came from a site visit in Portland with Portland Metro for putting in charging infrastructure for their first all-electric Proterra transit bus. So every day it seems like another opportunity that's cropping up in a different part of the charging ecosystem in Maine, and all of those things I think point to a pretty rapid acceleration of electrification for vehicles, all kinds of vehicles.
And Barry, if you could wave a magic wand in Maine and pick one thing to do to increase the penetration or sales of EVs, what would you say?
That's a very tough question. I think I look at the cars and the infrastructure as two sides of the same coin. Yeah. So if I think about the coin itself, I think that the manufacturers need to continue to roll out consumer options, and that includes not just types of vehicles, SUVs and pickups, but different price points that are more competitive with combustion, whether that's through vehicle incentives and so forth. I think that's critical. But I also look at Tesla as an example of a company that's been able to accelerate its deployment of vehicles because of its investments, private investments in its own charging infrastructure. And they've created a model that, I mean, all the other manufacturers could follow if they had the will. So I'm not sure that answers in a nice, concise way, but like most questions like that, it doesn't slice neatly, but I think those are two areas.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Jeff, I'm going to go to you next. I don't know if you can address Maine.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe first, I totally agree with you, Barry. I'm thankful that New Hampshire is so narrow that it's not too much of a concern for me to get across it without relying on a network of charging stations. I'd say charging infrastructure has always been a focus area of mine, and I think in a lot of the work that we do, I like to remind people that it's not as hard as it needs to be. Like, honestly, to get good coverage of charging infrastructure, the level of investment we're talking about, it's not huge. We can do this. And when I look at the map of Maine, I'm sure that most mainstream consumers are looking at the map of charging stations out there and saying, oh, looks like I can get most of the places I want to, but there's still good chunks of the state where I'd feel a little bit outside of the safety net. So I think there needs to be ongoing investment on that front. And it's not just about getting that initial, geographic connectivity that you can get where you need to go. I've worked in a lot of jurisdictions where they focus on, having that nice map of dots that, you can get it wherever you want, only to find that, oh, wow, EV adoption is picking up. We're going to need to be able to charge more than 1 or 2 cars at a time pretty soon. That's something that Tesla's been doing right from the start, making sure that their charging stations can handle a large volume of cars. And that's something that really needs to transfer over to the other charging networks that are out there. So that's certainly top of mind. But I'd say when I think about a lot of the work that we do in some parts of Canada, I think that a lot of them, we're doing some work in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick right now. They look across the border to Maine, and they're very envious of 2 fronts. One, you guys do have a financial incentive. And 2, you're one of the ZEV states, meaning that there is a mandate in place requiring automakers to meet minimum targets. We just released a study for Canada 2 weeks ago showing that there's a huge lack of availability of EVs in dealerships. And there's a real big push across Canada to see if we can rectify that situation. I'm not saying that, I'm guessing that it's probably still a bit of a challenge to find an EV in Maine, but the fact that you already have some of that legislation in place means that, if somebody is starting to think that an EV might be a good fit, there's a better chance that they'll be able to walk into a dealership and find a few that they can choose from. So I think, relatively speaking, Maine is doing better than a lot of other places in North America.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And I'd make 2 comments. First, I've got 9 Leafs sitting on the lot. Should you know someone who needs one?
Great.
They're around. But you're right, the supply goes up and down. It really changes quite a bit. And the other two more things. One, I was charging up at LL Beans, behind Beans in Freeport, and there was a guy charging from Texas. He had Tesla. And I asked him, he said he drove here from Texas. He said it was not that hard.
Yeah,
Said you just,
absolutely.
You got to stop and charge, but you stop for lunch, you stop for dinner.
Yeah, and honestly, I think maybe one of the components is just, I think there's a real lack of awareness of the progress that's been made. So there's certainly some benefits, putting some efforts into raising awareness of the pieces that are in place right now. Because I think generally speaking, you'll find people will be surprised if they pulled up a map of the charging stations and see how many are out there. So, and
you can make it to Millinocket. You can go to Acadia. I mean, all these things you can do with electric cars. There's enough.
Exactly. And Adam, can I add in a little bit on the progress of Maine?
Yeah. Yes.
I've only been gone for 2.5 months, but I will say, so before I left, I was working at Efficiency Maine, and because of the Volkswagen settlement funds, they were able to create a rebate program. So starting, I guess it was the end of last August, I think there's been great progress made. The instant EV rebate, Efficiency Maine has 50 car dealers signed up. You go to the dealership, you purchase or lease an all-electric vehicle, you get $2,000 right off the top of your bill. If you get a plug-in hybrid, you get $1,000. If you're a local government, you get $7,500. If you qualify for LIHEAP, you get even more. So we were seeing, when I was there, and again, I don't speak for Efficiency Maine, I don't work there anymore, but before I left, we were seeing, and before the pandemic, about 20 instant EV rebates a week. And if you look at the number of registrations in Maine before that, that's a huge increase. So there's progress on that front. And then the other front is that Efficiency Maine has been funding through grants level 2 chargers, and also the first one was a DC fast charging network, which I think there's one left in Wyndham to be completed, but then they're going to do a second DC fast charging corridor. So I think if you're in Maine, if you look up the map of chargers, you will be surprised if you're not an EV driver already. And if you're in Maine and Adam has those 9 leafs, you look at a federal tax credit of up to $7,500 on your federal taxes. You get a $2,000 instant rebate from the state. You look at fuel savings over the life of that vehicle and the drastic savings on maintenance because of the EV, the simpler motor, just everything about it. That's pretty attractive. And so I would push people to go try out. The biggest thing for people who think, oh, I can't afford it, I wouldn't like it, it doesn't work for me, go try one out. And a lot of people find once they open their minds to it, that it can actually work for them, at least one vehicle in the family. So I think Maine's made tremendous progress. I think a lot more needs to happen because Maine is behind, and there are lots of barriers, and we could go into that. But I think over the last year or so, Maine has made tremendous progress. And it's mostly because of the Volkswagen settlement funds. And so looking forward, the big question is how will future progress be funded? And if consumers demanded EVs, like Dr. Colgan was saying, then it would happen. But we need people to have the will to at least consider electric vehicles and cleaner cars.
Yeah.
And if I could add, without going down a rabbit hole of charging station, I think it's important for people who aren't familiar with electric vehicles to know that it's not the same fueling model as we have for gasoline. And even though we talk a lot about public charging infrastructure, the reality is that it's 80+% of the time you're charging at home. And so It's almost more like a cell phone analogy than it is a typical combustion engine type of model. So between home and workplace, most people don't rely heavily on the public charging. I do think Jeff will when he comes from Montreal, because he doesn't have a residence down here, or at least that I know of. So he's going to rely more on public charging, and our tourist market is going to certainly rely on it. But from a resident day-to-day use standpoint, it really isn't that complicated to use a vehicle in Maine.
And it's worth highlighting how that introduces a really challenging paradox for the business case for deploying public charging stations. This is something that we do a lot of work with. Imagine if the gas stations had to rely on 1/5 of the traffic that they see. It's really hard for public charging stations to make money on their own. So that's why I think there's an important role for governments and utilities in a lot of cases to play a role in addressing that gap in the market.
Right. Good. Thank you. I now want to transition just a little bit, staying on EVs, but am I correct that all of you drive an EV?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought so. Can you each just say a word or two, and I can add to it, on just the cost of owning one, but besides the cost of putting electricity in it? So what do you spend on oil changes, tuning up your engine, just the cost of owning one, and safety? How do you feel about the vehicle you drive? Jeff, I'll start with you and go around.
Sure. Well, you've already said besides fuel savings. So yeah, electricity for us in Quebec is even cheaper than the average in North America. So it's probably less than 1/5 of the cost of fueling up on gas. But in all the other items, I swap tires twice a year, from snow tires to summer tires. And then besides that, I don't know, my mechanic, it's great. My local mechanic, he also drives a Bolt. So I trust his advice on all this stuff, which is encouraging. I don't know, he's telling me to keep an eye on my brakes because I hardly ever use my brakes. So maybe there's something to be done on that front. But besides that, there's no oil changes. You look at the service schedule and the owner manual for a Chevy Bolt, and it's basically replace the cabin air filter, and then maybe at 150,000 miles or something like that, there's some coolant that you need to change. But it's, the cost of ownership is really one of the biggest benefits of owning an EV. On the safety front, honestly, I find it safer because the car is much more responsive. I do a lot of driving on rural roads, and if I need to pass a lot of tractors around here, if I need to pass a tractor, I can do it a lot more quickly than I've got an old gas Focus. It's a stick shift, and it takes you time to get into the right gear. Yeah, it's much more responsive and easier to get around. And honestly, even when a deer crosses the road, the fact that it'll start slowing down as soon as I lift up the throttle, I think that saves me a couple feet in stopping distance. So I think on a number of fronts, we generally, my wife and I, we always prefer to drive the EV versus our gas car. So it's our top choice for a number of fronts.
Okay, thank you. Barry, anything to add on the cost of ownership or safety?
Tires, that's the only consistent item that I think, and that's probably because I'm too heavy-footed with the way the torque works. Usually it's the front tires because I forget to rotate them. I've not had any concerns about safety. I drive a Chevy Bolt. I mean, I think that's curb weight is like around 3,500 pounds, which is not, it looks small from the outside, but it doesn't drive like a small car, and it feels, maybe because of the batteries, it feels like it's got a lot of mass. But thankfully, I have not had to test, the collision, the impact, any differences there with that vehicle. I think it's very fun to drive. It's responsive, and maybe, I agree with Jeff. I think maybe it's probably a safer car just to drive because of those features. But and I could turn that question back on you, Adam, because I understand you've been driving electric for a while.
Well, I have. I've been driving one for probably 5 or 6 years, and it's really the only thing I spend money on is, like Jeff said, tires. I have summer tires and winter tires. I don't think I've done brakes on a car. Maybe I've done wiper blades, but there is nothing. I mean, I'm going to come back to this. It poses a bit of an existential threat to car dealers, but I'll come back to that. Jennifer, I know you drive a fairly small EV.
Well,
right?
actually, Adam, I've upgraded. So I'm on my 3rd EV, and I used to drive up to Augusta every day, and I was driving a Volkswagen diesel. And I would use biodiesel, all that. But the car got old, so it was literally bankrupting me. And so I had to have it towed away. And that's when I switched to EV. I was working on EV stuff, but it really was because I couldn't afford at the time to buy a new car. So I leased an all-electric smart car, which is not for everyone because it's very small. And that's what you're thinking of, Adam. Yeah. But that cut my costs dramatically. And then I was able to charge at work. So I actually had that car for 3 years. And then I upgraded to the newer smart car and had that one for 3 years. And literally all I paid for, I leased it. It was very affordable. So I replaced a tire or two, but that was about it. And then recently, before I left Maine, I upgraded to a used Chevy Bolt. But I also, when I was at GP Cog, we had 2 different EVs that we would lend out. So I took care of a Nissan Leaf and then later a Chevy Bolt. So the costs for me personally have, when that diesel vehicle died, it really saved my budget. So another thing I'll mention is I've worked with a lot of local governments in Maine, and because of the reduced fuel costs and particularly the reduced maintenance costs, Portland, South Portland, Falmouth, I could go on the list, local governments have switched to EVs for their fleet vehicles and their staff vehicles because it just saves them money and headaches. And so it just makes financial sense.
And Jennifer, I don't know what you thought in terms of gas savings, but I mean, I'm thinking the average person probably could save $50 to $100 a month in gas, depending on what their driving habits are. I don't know if that
Sure, absolutely. And now I just bought a little house in California, and for the first time I have a little garage, and now I can just plug in my car and talk about easy. Because when I was in Maine, I lived on an island and I had to charge in town. I couldn't charge at home. So anyway, I mean, this is just the easiest scenario for me ever. It's just great.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And I will add that for most car dealerships, a substantial amount of their business comes from their service department.
Right.
So this will start to affect the model. I mean, there are so many cars on the road. It's going to be an awfully long time before there aren't gas-powered cars that need service. But it is something car dealers will need to look at. Does anybody think that COVID-19, this pandemic, is changing either attitudes about EVs or where they sort of fit into our life?
I think we've looked at this a fair amount lately. Certainly in urban environments, this is having a big impact just in terms of the commuting that happens in urban space. And I think there's two counter-opposing forces at play here. One is, in the near term at least, some reluctance to rely on public transit and people shifting towards cars. But the other factor, and something that would apply urban or rural or otherwise, is a shift to a greater amount of teleworking, working from home. And so ultimately, I think we have, we're moving in this direction, but I think ultimately we're going to be driving less overall. And I see that as actually maybe an impediment to EV adoption, because this is going to put a drag on actually that economic argument for owning an EV. These fuel savings that we're talking about aren't as important for people if they're not driving as much. So I think to a certain extent that might put a bit of a drag on EV adoption. But I'm not sure if it's going to be that long lasting an impact, or if people are going to start getting back to their usual routine in the near future.
I mean, from a climate standpoint, Jeff, it's fine to have people not driving.
Yeah.
And I think one thing COVID seems to have done is opened up the employees and employers' eyes as to, how much, working at home can be productive. It reduces a lot of costs, a lot of time, if, efficiencies are, improved. So that part of it. I've also heard, Adam, from an industry standpoint, that even though new car sales were down, EV sales in particular didn't seem to be that affected and may have actually improved. And I don't know if that's a state by state phenomena, but I don't know if you've heard anything in any of your, kind of market analysis of the impact of COVID directly on EV sales.
Well, I would say that, Barry, that there are, if you go to the Efficiency Maine website and look up what cars qualify, there's, I think, between EVs and plug-in hybrids, which is, a hybrid that also has a range of from 12 to 50 miles on electric. I think there are 28 models that qualify. There are models people have never even heard of. There are suddenly between Kia and Hyundai and Honda and BMW and Volkswagen, that just with everybody's got a couple coming out. Some have, 3, 4, 5, 6 coming out. That alone will increase penetration. Just that suddenly it's not the Nissan Leaf. For the longest time it was just the Leaf. So that's great. It's, I don't sell most of those models. I wish I did. I'm jealous, but that's okay. It's better for me.
And crucially, entering into new market segments as well. A lot of compact SUVs, plug-in SUVs from Toyota, Ford.
That's right.
Volkswagen just yesterday announcing another one, and that's a very popular vehicle segment that all of a sudden has a number of plug-in options.
That's right. It'll be helpful. The ones that aren't electric, that are plug-in electric, some of those cars, when you factor in the normal driving, they're getting anywhere from 40 to 80 miles per gallon, which is, remarkable, considering most of these vehicles were getting 28 miles per gallon before. So I'm gonna ask 2 quick questions and go around, and then we're gonna see if there are questions from the audience. So we are at about 2% of the fleet each year of new car sales are EVs. Where do you think we're gonna be in 10 years? Jeff?
This is easy for me because we spend a lot of our projects are doing these kinds of forecasts. So I think we'll be, give or take, about 30% of new sales by 2030. That's an easy benchmark that I keep in the back of my mind. Some markets will be ahead of that. Maine might be a bit ahead of that. But overall, I think that's probably a good benchmark to keep in mind.
What do you think, Jennifer? And you could speak for California and Maine if you'd like.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you all saw it, but our governor yesterday announced a ban of the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles in 2035. And we have a list this long of climate goals, from clean energy to, EV charging infrastructure and how many EVs in our state fleet and all these different things. So he's definitely ramping up. We have a ZEV action plan. So I think everything that we have on the books is going to be accelerated. So in California, in 2018, there were, almost 8% of vehicles registered in California were EVs. So I think that it's definitely going to increase for sure.
And Barry?
If you look at chapter 10 of The Innovator's Dilemma, he looks at, this is that Harvard Law School professor, Christensen. He looks at electric vehicles as an example of disruptive technology. And for him, it's a price point issue. And so, Tesla's just announced that they can, with their new battery technology, come up with a $25,000 car that'll get 400 miles of range. You compare that to a $25,000 combustion engine vehicle, and the discrepancy between the performance, the cost savings, the ability to plug it into your house and maybe use that energy bidirectionally. It's just the superiority of the technology means that it's going to have a huge ramp up. And so if that happens in 5 years, I think consumers, look at how quickly the cell phone was adopted. I think consumers, I think Jeff's conservative, so I'll let some of my optimism shine through. But if we get the kind of battery performance that Tesla's talking about and the price reductions, I think we could be well on our way to meeting California's 2035 goals as a nation.
Well, I certainly hope that happens. And, there have been surprises, that is for sure. The Leaf came out, it was 80-mile range, 100-mile range. I think it might have been 100-mile, but it actually got 70.
Yeah.
And, and that was the reality. And now, certainly with the Teslas, you can, if you drive a little conservatively, you can get 280 to 300 miles. So one last question, then I'm going to open it up to other questions. Charlie touched on this, Professor Colgan. If there was a price on carbon, whether it's cap and trade or modeled after Reggie, do you think that would accelerate EVs? Some of that money would rebate them? Jennifer?
Yeah, I have always thought that a carbon tax was the answer. And I think he explained it better than I can. But I do think that without that, people are just not thinking about what the repercussions are of their energy use. They don't think about it.
Yeah.
I like it in that it's a very natural tool, set a price on carbon and let the market figure out the solution. That said, I think the challenge here is that EVs already are really cheap to run. So we're already talking about, maybe 1/5 or a quarter of the operating costs compared to a gas car. And the question is whether, increasing the cost of operation of a gas car, so it's even a little bit more, how much is that going to sway purchases of new vehicles? A lot of the modeling that we do, we look at the economic side of, that upfront incremental cost versus the long-term savings. And ultimately, consumers don't really pay that much attention to the long-term savings. Maybe we can address that through better education. But from the research that we've seen, that price on carbon would have to be pretty high to motivate people to shift in sufficient numbers towards electric vehicles. And I think it just comes down to the fact that certain areas of our economy are easier to decarbonize, and that price of carbon might shift those areas quicker. But decarbonizing transportation means, significant upfront investments. And I think from what we've seen, it would need a pretty hefty carbon tax before you'd see it really having an impact on the choices people make about the type of vehicle they drive.
Yeah. All right, Jeff, I'm going to make a couple quick comments. I think the maintenance savings are dramatic. And I think this is something the average person just doesn't focus on, who doesn't own one. And that possibly police departments, schools, post offices, the fleets, government fleets, where they keep these cars for, it's not uncommon to see a car with 150,000 miles on it, maybe not a police car, or school buses. I think these are areas where the savings would far outweigh the increase in cost. And frankly, the school buses are expensive, the electric school buses, but those will come down. But I think a shift in our focus to maintenance savings and just how efficient the vehicles are would be helpful. And Efficiency Maine has done a lot to promote that. One thing I'd like to plant the seed and then ask John if there are questions I read a very good article that Professor Colgan wrote probably 30 years ago about the fact that in 30 years, which is today, and it's been going on since, Maine will have a serious shortage of people, not enough people to do the work. Now, this is offset today by the pandemic, but put that aside just for now. And he also talked about the paper industry, that, you know, it was obvious 30 years ago that this industry was in jeopardy. And so he called this out 30 years ago, and essentially we did very little because I think we just didn't know what to do. Well, we're talking about a future without gasoline-powered cars. The oil industry is a huge part of our economy. So the question, I'm not asking for answers, I'm just planting this seed. We need to remember that there are going to be millions of people, whether they make pipe or drilling equipment or refineries, whatever it is. You know, look at the size of Halliburton. Some of these companies are enormous. What are all these people going to do for work? We need to be thinking about this today so we don't wake up in 30 years and somehow we're surprised that there are millions of people newly unemployed because of the success of another technology. With that, I'm going to ask John if there are questions from the audience.
Yeah, Adam, there are, and would you like to field them, or would you like me to just read them out? Either way is fine. If
Why
you're,
don't you go ahead and read them, and maybe I'll
okay, yeah, and you can help steer if needed. Okay, so here's the first one. What about California's governor setting a date to ban the sale of gas-only cars? Jennifer already said that's 2035. Do they already require solar on new homes? And I think I have heard that too. Jennifer, can you address either of those, the solar
So
requirement?
just to be clear, the executive order was issued yesterday about the ban on the sale of new internal combustion engines by 2035. Solar, I'm not up on everything, but I believe that new development in California does require solar. That's not my area, but I know, for example, I just bought a home and I was looking around. They have the PACE program. I can probably put solar on my house pretty easily. So there are lots of programs in place. I can also get funding to do drought tolerant landscaping in my backyard. I mean, if you look around, there's lots of programs that you can take advantage of. I have PG&E for utilities. I'm going to get an $800 rebate just for having an electric vehicle.
Okay.
Jennifer, this just reminds me of something you were telling me last week. What did you call you have to justify on the EV, you have to justify why you would need a gasoline even now.
For the state policy. Yeah,
state.
So on our state fleet side, our goal is, and again, I don't manage that program, but the goal is 50% of light duty vehicles in the state fleet by 2025. So currently we have about 30%. We have over 1,200 plug-in vehicles in the state fleet. And the policy now is, and again, I think this is going to be accelerated. If you're a state agency or department and you want to purchase a new car, if it's a sedan, we have a policy called ZEV First. So unless you can come up with extremely important reasons why you can't go with the ZEV or the electric model, you cannot procure a gas or diesel vehicle. So that's in place right now. So if you're a state department and you want to purchase vehicles, again, you have to show why you can't have an EV. And then before you can get the EVs, you have to go through my department and we will make sure that you have the proper charging infrastructure in place before you can get those vehicles. So we have a pretty aggressive process in place for state facilities to get new vehicles and then to have the charging infrastructure, both for fleet and also for workplace. We have a goal of 5% workplace charging across the board at all state facilities. And then the state has overall goal of 5 million ZEVs, which is electric and hydrogen. But right now we're really focused on electric by 2030. So we have some aggressive goals in place.
Maybe some good ideas for Maine.
One thing
Another
that's worth
question.
adding is just that policy leaves the door open to plug-in hybrids as well, which Adam mentioned earlier. Those are vehicles that really offer the best of both worlds: electric for your daily driving, but you can still cover long distances.
Yep.
So those are still on the table.
And Jeff, since you're talking, maybe this is best for you since you're the tech guy. How about uniformity of charging method and plug configuration? Remember, a lot of us don't know that much about EVs, so even basic stuff like that would be really helpful.
Absolutely, and this has been a hot topic for many years. I'm sure Barry can comment on this as well, since he's deep in the infrastructure space. But basically, let's remember that 80% of the charging you do is going to be at home, somewhere around there, maybe at home or at work. And this is charging that happens, there's a piece of equipment that you would either carry in the trunk of your car and plug into a regular outlet, or you'd install a fixed 240-volt charging station. And those use a standard connector that every vehicle in the market uses the same connector, one exception being Tesla. They have an adapter. Where it gets a little bit more messy is with fast charging infrastructure. And that's where over the past 5 to 10 years, we've seen a bit of a standards battle between two different connectors for fast chargers. Generally speaking, some of the Japanese manufacturers like Nissan went with one approach, one type of connector, whereas we saw the North American and European automakers choose a new connector. So that required us to have charging stations that had two different connectors, and you needed to know which one you'd plug in. It's pretty simple. It means people have to learn the names of these connectors, and it makes it seem more complicated than it really is. But fortunately, more recently, we've seen Japanese automakers, including Nissan, now shift to that North American and European standard. So I think going forward, we're seeing the end of this sort of standards battle, and that should make things easier for people going forward, so they don't need to learn what connector they have and learn the complicated names that people gave these things for some reason.
And the newer DC fast chargers have both connectors.
So what they have, yeah, exactly. So that
in Maine,
exactly.
The ones that Efficiency Maine is installing, just for Maine's sake, those all have both chargers for fast charging.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think you're right, though, Jeff. There's been a movement to consolidate towards the combo standard.
Yeah.
I think, I think they're kind of cumbersome connectors, to be honest. It would be nice for people to now look at the Tesla supercharger connector, and, there's ways to simplify it even further, which I think the industry will probably figure out.
Can anybody speak to what you do with the used battery in a EV car? We could think of sort of the life cycle analysis of an electric car. Anyone know anything about disposal or recycling of batteries?
I think the first thing that's worth saying is that studies have shown that batteries are typically going to last the life of the vehicle. There might be a few exceptions to that. Some manufacturers, their batteries are a bit less robust, but going forward, it seems that most automakers are making their cars with a battery that will last 10 to 15 years. So this isn't something you need to consider. But regardless, at some point, the vehicle will move on to greener pastures, and we'll have to do something with these batteries. And there are a number of efforts ongoing across North America, across the world, to figure out how to recycle lithium batteries with some promising progress. We have two different companies based up here in Montreal that are focusing on this. And I think the limiting factor so far has just been the size of the market. The first mass market EVs were only sold in 2010. So we're only now just starting to see EVs being scrapped. So I think that pressure for recycling is only just now about to start picking up.
I would add, Jeff, that I think the other it is early, I think, still in terms of figuring out the best application for batteries that degrade. But with these size batteries, I mean, you can still get additional use out of them even after they degrade too much for transportation applications. So I think you'll see actually some value extracted from these used batteries in other areas, whether that's the built environment or other applications, even before they finally go hit the recycling.
And there's a lot of effort underway for standardizing the battery recycling to reuse the components.
Okay, here's an easy one. Someone would like to know what you all drive.
think we all drive a Chevy
Jeff,
Bolt.
go first.
I think we've already brought this up. I'm pretty sure all three of us drive Chevy Bolts. Is that right?
Is that right?
It's true. It's true. But like I said, I have driven 2 different little smart cars, which are not for everybody. But I've also was responsible for a Nissan Leaf for a number of years. And now I drive a used Chevy Bolt, which I love.
But for the record, I have Tesla envy, which at some point I will probably have to do something about.
Yeah.
Oh, when it gets to 25,000, I think everybody's going to go.
Yeah.
I saw somebody's asking about electric pickup trucks, and I also have a 17-year-old Ford Ranger in my driveway. So I live on a farm, so we're keeping our eyes out for those electric pickups that are coming to market. I think we've seen, back we mentioned the electric crossovers that are just starting to hit the market. Those are actually a more popular segment than pickups, even though the few pickup models that are out there on their own, each of them outsell all the other models. But I think this is a really exciting time. Lots of news about the electric F-150 just last week. So I think this is really going to open the door, especially for a lot of the fleets. We do a lot of work with municipal fleets that trying to figure out how to electrify. And I think in the next year or two, we're going to start to see some plug-in pickup truck options, and that's really going to open the door for a lot of folks.
Hey, John.
Yeah, and Tesla says they have 600,000 orders for that Cybertruck. We'll see. I don't know.
There is one question I want to make sure we answer about what do you have to do to have a charging station at home? I mean, you can charge from a regular plug, but it's quite slow. You could do, I think it's level 2. If you have whatever source of electricity you have for your dryer, your clothes dryer, that same wire coming into your house, if you can sort of split it off, you need an electrician, clearly. That 240 is what you need. You can put a little thing right in your garage. I pull into my garage. I try not to charge at home that often because I'd rather use Tesla's charging in Freeport. But you plug in, you wake up every day, and you have a full tank of gas, which is the best thing. I rarely have to stop somewhere.
And I'd add, Adam, that you don't necessarily even need to upgrade your electrical service, because I've had 100 amp services in some older houses where, because you're charging at night, you're not using, you're not competing with any other loads. So you'd be surprised at how little electricity the service has to have to be able to work.
Yeah.
Right.
All right.
And so for me, I've just bought a house. Right now I'm using the level 1 charger that's just going into a 110, and I'm not commuting to work. So that's sufficient, but I do plan on getting a level 2. I just had my electrician switch my dryer from gas to electric. So now I have that plug. And what I plan to do is get one of the home level 2 chargers, probably $500, that is can plug in and out. So it's not hardwired. And then I can switch between my dryer and the level 2 charger. And so again, I'm going to get incentive money back from the utility, but there's also a federal tax credit for home chargers. So on my taxes, I'll also put in for a rebate. It's 30% or up to $1,000. So even on the charging infrastructure, you can get incentives back.
Good.
So,
Well, John, I think we've reached the end.
we have reached the end, and out of respect of everybody's time, let me take a minute or two to close this down. I've just got one question for Adam. It can be rhetorical. I was just wondering if you had a blue leaf on the lot in Topsom, because I'm only 10 minutes away, and
John, I can find you one.
Okay, because
I'll find you one.
these guys have convinced me. So
You need to get down there.
thank you all for being here today. You all were fantastic. We all learned a lot. And Adam, thank you for your keynote earlier and your Sputnik inspiration. We can do this. We will do this. We need to do this for the next generation, so we will. So thank you all. You can go off video if you want to. We are all applauding you if you can't see that. Let me just remind everybody of next week, same time, same station. We're going to have several business owners from Greg Adams, Irving Woodlands, Bill Mook Sea Farms, Jenny Tilton Flood Brothers Farms Dairy in Clinton, Maine. We've also got Megan Helstedt from Hannaford, John Fitzpatrick from the Jackson Lab, Lydia Covert from Unum, and Ethan Austin from Sugarloaf. So we've got a lot of business owners next week who are going to tell stories, true stories about what they're doing and how they're confronting climate change, what they've learned, what worked and what didn't work. So if you're on, you may have signed up for next week, but tell others about it, and we will be back. I'll be back in Hannaford Hall next week. So thank everyone and hope to see you next week. We're signing off for now. Have a good day, folks. Bye.